What are some basic ways to explain to others that you don't have to only believe in God or only in science? We talked about this a little bit the last show, but you can actually believe in both. Much of us seem to think it's either one way or the other. And this is Jason in New Mexico. And I think just in generally from the Catholic perspective, so much what we talk about is both and, right? Especially in this case.
That's right. And some people have the mistaken belief that scientists are atheists in general, and that's not really true. Francis Collins reported two very big studies in his book on I think it was The Handwriting of God, or The Language of God was the name of the book. But in there he reported two big studies which said that 40% of bench scientists are declared believers in God. Now, that doesn't mean that the other 60% are atheists. I mean, a declared believer, right, is one thing, but who's not a declared believer? Someone who's not declaring, right? And are there some scientists who just don't say? Yes, there are. There are scientists who are scared for their tenure, or scared, that they might be, marginalized in a lab or something by somebody else, right? So there's lots of people who are non-declared, but they're still believers. There are also scientists who are agnostics, and what I call they're kind of the perpetually waiting agnostics. They're not against God. In fact, they're not against God at all. They're the wait and see people, right? I'm looking for the definitive evidence that's going to come from science. And of course, there is evidence from science, that we'll be talking about in this program and future programs that really point to God, but they're kind of holding off. And then there are the atheists. And of course, the atheists, last week's show, we talked about the fact that, science cannot prove atheism. It's impossible. Scientific evidence has to be observed. Observable evidence has to come from within our universe. And God is by definition outside of our universe. Therefore, you can't disprove God, by making an appeal to, evidence that comes from within our universe alone, because he's beyond our universe. Can't do it. So whatever kind of atheism scientists have, right, those scientists are not atheists because of science. They're atheists for the same reason everybody else is an atheist who is an atheist. Like what? They're reasons of the heart. Right? So some people refuse to believe because they were taught something terrible by their parents, or maybe in their schools or in their church, maybe that God is just interested in sending people to hell. Believe it or not, lots of people are told this, and of course they just say, I can't believe that. So they stop believing in God. Some people actually, are almost tormented in some cases by their religion. They just stop believing in God. Of course, that wasn't the case at all with me. I had wonderful parents and wonderful teachers and wonderful priests, right? But sometimes people just get the wrong message, and particularly in a really fundamentalist structure, where they're almost harangued by hell at all moments. There's another group of people, honestly, who can't reconcile suffering with the existence of God. And in our previous 6 or 7 episodes, we've been actually talking about that, and every once in a while it comes up again and again. But remember, we tried to redress that by looking, at, well, is suffering compatible with the loving God? It is, because suffering's compatible with love. Suffering actually helps us to love. Suffering actually helps us to get rid of our superficiality. Suffering actually helps us to deepen our faith and dependence on God. Suffering helps us to get to our salvation. So that's Jesus's viewpoint. But of course, we have to teach that to people. So that's another key, thought. But some people are atheists because they can't deal with the problem of suffering. They don't have enough knowledge of suffering, love, and God. And so that's a problem. And then you get a huge group of people who are just not going to be responsible to a moral agency outside of themselves. They're what I call kind of the Nietzschean, Sartrean faction of atheists, right? Who basically say, say, you know, I'm me, I'm the agent that I report to. You know, I don't want to report to God, and even if God exists, I'm not reporting to him anyway. I'm reporting to me. And so, of course, you get those kinds of Nietzschean atheists. They're certainly abundant in the culture as well. And then you get the kind of a lot of the Marxist atheists too, who basically say, you know, God, you know, is an opiate for the people who's preventing revolutions. And the only way we're going to get political progress is through revolution, right? So, of course, you know, that form of atheism, you know, which sees God as giving people hope and consolation in this world, instead of keeping them engendered just in anger and hatred and a desire to kind of overthrow and so forth, you know, which, and of course, revolution is not the only way to get to political progress, as history proves. But the point, of course, is, you know, you see all these things, and then there's so many revisionist views of church history and world history. I mean, it goes on and on. But these are matters of the heart. They're not matters of science. They're not matters of reason. People are atheists either because they want to be atheists, because that's, you know, where their proclivities lie, or because they're having trouble dealing with a problem like suffering, or dealing with the background that they might have had. And we can help those people, but the ones who really want to be an atheist at all costs, we're, you know, honestly, don't throw your pearls before swine. You're not going to convince them.
Well, Father,
So
don't
at the
you
end of
think
the
also
day,
with those people, those situations, so I think today it's cool to be an atheist or an agnostic. And of course, if we think about Nietzsche, he ended up losing his mind, and I think Sartre had a different opinion at the very end of his life about
Yes,
God,
he did, yeah.
God and eternity, as I recall. So it's amazing how situations alter cases. Let me ask you the question, because we're talking about the Catholic Church, whether it, in a sense, supported science or was anti-science over the years. And you made a very good point, I think, about the fact that we don't teach history today. People don't have an historical understanding of how things develop. We think like the world just showed up yesterday, and whatever it's been today is the way it's always been, and that's not true. Also, let me ask you, today, as you're indicating, here we have, and we talked in the other shows about the fact that there's so much evidence to support, you know, the theistic understanding, the belief in God and the prime mover and the creator, and so many people don't seem to. Now, is it true then that throughout time, scientists have always been the most skeptical ones, and maybe at one time in the culture that wasn't accepted, so they don't say anything, and now we have the inverse, where to be accepted as a scientist, you virtually have to say that you're an atheist or an agnostic?
Yeah, I think, you know, among my friends, honestly, there really is an acceptance of people, scientists who are believers, right? I just don't see a huge prejudice against them, but there are, in what I would call, there are certain antagonists who I wouldn't call them bench scientists per se, or real research scientists. The real antagonists are like the television jockeys, right? These are the people who are going out, you know, and they're making a lot of money doing it, by the way. You know, they're making a ton of money by sort of proclaiming this new doctrine. They've kind of got their own little popular cult going. But, you know, these are not, you know, I would say the greatest scientist who has, you know, kind of wavered throughout his life, who's, you know, displayed overtly atheism, is Stephen Hawking. Now, he has talked about atheism, but also, remember, Stephen has also talked about theism. Stephen has talked about agnosticism, and he's wavered back and forth. I mean, you know, in his book, Brief History of Time, right, where he still had basically the same scientific background, right, Stephen at that point asked, you know, what was the flame? You know, what was the force, the flame that kind of, you know, infused energy into the equations of physics, right? I mean, the equations can't explain themselves, and Stephen knew that. Now, of course, he's gone backward in his new book, right? You know, where he, you know, Cosmic Design, you know, or the Grand Design, and he's gone back and said, well, you know, the equations of gravity will do it. Well, that's the exact opposite opinion he had in Brief History of Time, where he said the equations can explain themselves at least as active equations, as energetic equations. All the equations do is explain the laws under which energy is operating or gravity is operating. So, you know, which is it, Stephen? You know, and so at the end of the day, I think what you're really seeing is really not a lot of scientists who are out there proclaiming the atheistic doctrine, but of course there is pressure in certain schools, pressure in labs, there's pressure on the media, and of course, you know, people, as you put it, there are a lot of people who want to be quote-unquote cool atheists. Right. But you better watch out when you're a cool atheist, because number one, there's no evidence for your position, either from science or philosophy. Atheism can never be proven. There are only three ways of disproving anything. You can use a contradiction, you can use, that it disproves a sensorial fact, an observable fact, or you can use both. The problem is you can't get a contradiction. Pure existence exists, can never be contradicted. Moreover, God is absolutely simple because he's unrestricted. Therefore, an unrestricted entity which is simple, there's no contradiction in it, right? What does it mean to be simple? That there's no intrinsic restriction and there's no extrinsic restriction. But if there's no restriction, there's nothing to be contradicted. You can't get an intrinsic contradiction of God defined as pure, unrestricted being. It's impossible. And you can't get a disproof from empirical data because, as I just said in the previous thing, God's beyond empirical data. Therefore, there's not going to be any empirical datum that disproves him. So finally, you try the combination, and the combination is just as worthless because the two things which lead to the combination can't be used against God. At the end of the day, you're not going to ever get a rational disproof of God. It's just not possible. So, when you've gotten to that point, then you just have to say, well, why? Why would scientists take this viewpoint, this skeptical viewpoint? Because, of course, some of them want to remain absolutely skeptical to the end, be truthful to the empirical methodology. They're just not going, they're going to back themselves into materialism whether they like it or not. But I'll tell you something, near-death experiences are not explicable, and we can talk about this in other episodes. But near-death experiences are already transcending that materialism. Scientists are going to have to deal with this. They're going to have to deal with some of these extraordinary miracles, which now, the proof is layered. There's tests upon tests.